I paid for the wedding in full, but my daughter-in-law insisted on excluding him from the guest list. I've been sitting on this story for a while, and it's about time I got it off my chest. My son, Jake, has always been a good kid, hardworking, decent, the kind of guy who'd give you the shirt off his back. He's 28 now, works as a mechanic, and up until a few years ago, we had a solid relationship. Then he met Sarah. I knew from the jump she was trouble. She's 26, loud, and has this way of acting like the world owes her something. The first time I met her, she spent the whole dinner complaining about her job, her apartment, her life, like nothing was ever good enough. Jake just sat there, nodding along, totally hooked. I didn't get it then, and I still don't. Things got worse when they moved in together. Sarah quit her job because she said it was too stressful. And suddenly Jake was covering all the bills. I'd stop by their place sometimes, and I'd see these shopping bags everywhere, new clothes, shoes, random crap from Amazon. Jake's paycheck was disappearing faster than he could earn it, and Sarah didn't seem to care. She'd just laugh it off, saying she deserved nice things. I'd ask Jake about it, and he'd shrug, saying he wanted her to be happy. I told him she was reckless with money, but he'd get this look, like I was the bad guy for pointing it out. Her parents didn't help either. They're these flaky types who live a couple hours away and never chipped in a dime. Not for rent, not for groceries, nothing. Meanwhile, I'd been helping Jake out here and there, fixed his car once, covered a month's rent when he was short. I didn't mind doing it for him, but it burned me up that Sarah's folks just sat back while she bled him dry. I brought it up once, told Jake it wasn't fair her parents didn't pitch in. Next thing I know, he's barely talking to me. Turns out Sarah went crying to him, saying I was a miser who didn't understand love. Jake called me up pissed, telling me to back off. We argued hard that night. I told him straight up not to marry her. He didn't listen. After that fight, things between me and Jake stayed tense. He'd still call sometimes, but it was short, surface-level stuff about work or the weather. Sarah was always in the background, and I could feel her influence creeping in. I'd hear her voice through the phone, telling him to wrap it up or complaining about something. It was clear she didn't want me around, and Jake wasn't pushing back. I tried to let it go, figuring he'd see through her eventually. Then they got engaged. He told me over text, just a quick, "Hey Dad, we're getting married." No call, no excitement, just that. I knew it was her idea. She'd been dropping hints about rings for months. I didn't say much at first. My wife, Linda, got excited though. She's always been the peacemaker, the one who sees the best in people. She started talking about wedding plans right away, venues, flowers, the whole deal. I told her I wasn't thrilled about Sarah, but Linda brushed it off, saying Jake loved her, and that was what mattered. I couldn't argue with that logic, even if I wanted to. So I kept my mouth shut and let Linda take the lead. She spent weeks calling vendors, picking out decorations, making lists. I didn't care about the details. I just wanted Jake to be happy. But then the bills started rolling in. Linda would show me the costs, thousands for a dress, more for catering, some ridiculous deposit for a fancy hall. I asked her if Sarah's parents were helping at all. She shook her head, said they hadn't offered a penny. That's when I lost it. I told Linda it wasn't right. Jake was already stretched thin, and now I was footing the bill for this whole thing while Sarah's folks did nothing. Linda agreed it was unfair but said we couldn't back out now. So I paid. Every invoice, every charge straight from my savings. I didn't tell Jake I was covering it all. I didn't want him feeling guilty. But deep down, I was furious. The wedding planning kept rolling along, and Linda was in deep. She'd come home every night with updates, cake flavors, table settings, guest lists. I'd nod and write the checks. By then, I'd shelled out close to $30,000, and it wasn't even half done. Jake called once to thank us, but it was quick, like he was scared Sarah would overhear. I asked him if her parents were ever going to step up. He got quiet, then said they were busy, and didn't have much to spare. I told him that was bullshit. Busy doesn't mean you let someone else pay for your kid's wedding. He mumbled something about not wanting to fight and hung up. That call stuck with me. I knew Sarah was pulling the strings. Then came the guest list drama. Linda had been working on it with Jake, and they'd send us a draft. I scanned it, expecting the usual, family, friends, a few co-workers. My name wasn't on it. I asked Linda about it, thinking it was a mistake. She looked uncomfortable, said Sarah had concerns about me being there. Concerns? I'd paid for the damn thing, every cent, and now I wasn't welcome? Linda tried to smooth it over, said Sarah thought I didn't like her and didn't want the tension at the wedding. I told Linda that was insane. I didn't like Sarah, sure, but I wasn't going to ruin Jake's day. Linda said she talked to Jake about it, but I could tell she didn't want to push too hard. A few days later, Jake called. He sounded exhausted. He said Sarah was adamant I wasn't allowed to come. She told him I'd been hostile from the start, that I'd never accepted her. I reminded him I'd paid for everything, that I'd done nothing but support him. He didn't argue, just said it was her day, and she got to decide. I told him not to marry her again, louder this time. He hung up. I was done playing nice. After Jake hung up, I sat there fuming. The whole thing was ridiculous. I'd dumped a fortune into this wedding, and now I was the bad guy. I told Linda what happened, and even she couldn't hide her frustration. She said she tried talking to Jake herself, but I wasn't holding my breath. Sarah had him wrapped around her finger, and he wasn't about to stand up to her. I started thinking about pulling the plug, canceling the payments, letting them figure it out. But Linda begged me not to. She said it'd destroy Jake, that he'd never forgive me. I didn't want that either, so I let it ride. The wedding was 2 months out, and I figured I'd just deal with being excluded. Linda kept planning, but I could tell it was wearing on her. She'd come home late from meetings with the caterer or the florist, looking drained. Sarah was calling her constantly, changing things, more guests, fancier food, extra decorations. Every tweak meant more money, and I was the one covering it. I'd see the bank statements and feel my blood pressure spike. Sarah didn't care, she acted like it was all free. I asked Linda once if Sarah ever said thanks. She shook her head, said Sarah just complained about what wasn't perfect yet. That was when I started hating her. Not just disliking her, hating her. I decided I wasn't going to sit it out. They could leave me off the list, but I'd paid for it, and I was going to be there. Linda didn't like the idea, she said it'd cause a scene. I told her I didn't care anymore. Jake was my son, and I wasn't letting Sarah erase me from his life. The wedding day was coming up fast, and I marked it on my calendar. I wasn't sure what I'd do when I got there, but I wasn't staying home. The weeks leading up to the wedding dragged on. Linda was a wreck, juggling last-minute details while trying to keep the peace. She'd tell me about Sarah's latest demands, extra chairs for her cousins, a bigger cake, some over-the-top photo booth. I stopped asking how much it cost. I just signed the checks and kept my mouth shut. By then, I'd dropped over $40,000, and I knew it wasn't stopping. Jake called once to check in, but it was awkward. He didn't bring up the guest list, and I didn't either. I could hear Sarah in the background, laughing about something, and it took everything not to lose it on him. I started planning my move. The wedding was at this big venue downtown, a banquet hall with chandeliers and a dance floor. I knew the layout from Linda's endless updates. I figured I'd show up, stay low-key, and watch from the back. No confrontation, just presence. I told Linda my plan, and she begged me to reconsider. She said Sarah would flip out, that it'd ruin the day. I told her the day was already ruined for me. I wasn't invited to my own son's wedding after paying for it. She didn't argue after that, just looked worried. The night before, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Jake, how he used to be this independent kid, always figuring stuff out on his own. Now he was letting Sarah run everything, and I couldn't shake the feeling I'd lost him. I got my suit ready, a plain black one I'd worn to funerals and job interviews. No point in dressing flashy. I wasn't there to impress anyone. Linda left early the next morning to help set up, and I sat alone with my coffee, waiting for the right time to head out. I wasn't nervous, just pissed. The clock hit noon, and I grabbed my keys. I pulled up to the venue around 3 p.m. The parking lot was packed, cars lined up, people in dresses and suits filing in. I spotted Linda's car near the entrance, but I didn't see her. The ceremony was set to start at 4, so I had time. I stayed in my truck for a bit, watching. Guests were chatting, laughing, totally oblivious to the mess behind this thing. I saw Sarah's parents roll up in a beat-up sedan. They looked out of place among the nicer cars, and I couldn't help feeling smug. They hadn't paid a dime, and here they were, strolling in like they owned it. I got out and walked toward the hall. No one stopped me at the door. The staff was too busy running around with trays and flowers. Inside, it was chaos. Linda had outdone herself. The place was decked out with white tablecloths, centerpieces, string lights hanging everywhere. My money, all over the room. I found a spot near the back, behind a pillar where I could see the aisle but stay out of sight. The seats were filling up fast, and I recognized a few faces, Jake's buddies from work, some cousins, my sister and her husband. No one noticed me. Then Sarah walked in. She was in her dress, big and white and expensive looking, trailing behind her like she was royalty. She didn't see me at first. She was too busy barking at some poor coordinator about the music. I stayed still, keeping my head down. The ceremony music started, and Jake came out, looking nervous in his tux. He stood at the front, hands fidgeting. I felt a pang. He was still my kid, even with all this crap. Sarah started down the aisle, and that's when she spotted me. Her face went red, and she froze halfway, staring straight at me like I just crashed her whole world. Sarah stood there, stuck in the middle of the aisle, her eyes locked on me. The music kept playing, but the room went quiet. Everyone turned to see what was happening. Jake looked confused, following her gaze until he saw me too. His face dropped. Sarah's parents were in the front row, whispering to each other, and Linda was off to the side, hands over her mouth. I didn't move. I just sat there, staring back at Sarah, waiting to see what she'd do. She didn't disappoint. She threw her bouquet down, stormed over to me, and started yelling. Her voice was shrill, cutting through the silence, calling me selfish, disrespectful, a control freak. She said I'd ruined everything by showing up. People started shifting in their seats, some pulling out phones to record. Jake walked over, trying to calm her down, but she wasn't having it. She turned on him, screaming that he should have made sure I stayed away, that this was his fault too. I stood up then, not to fight, just to face her. I told her I'd paid for every inch of this wedding, that I had every right to be there. She laughed, this bitter, loud sound, and said I didn't own her or Jake, that money didn't buy me a say. Jake grabbed her arm, telling her to stop, but she yanked away and kept going, saying I never accepted her, that I was the reason their relationship was a mess. The coordinator tried to step in, but Sarah was past reasoning. She kicked over a chair, tears streaming down her face, and yelled that the wedding was off. Guests gasped, and Jake just stood there, looking lost. Sarah's parents rushed up, trying to pull her away, but she shoved them off too. She stormed out the side door, leaving everyone stunned. I didn't feel good about it, just empty. The room stayed frozen for a minute after Sarah bolted. Jake didn't move, he just stared at the spot where she'd been, his shoulders slumped. Guests started murmuring, some heading for the exits, others hovering like they didn't know what to do. Linda came over to me, her face pale. She asked why I'd come, said she'd warned me this would happen. I told her I couldn't sit home while Sarah cut me out of Jake's life, not after everything I'd done. She didn't argue, just shook her head and went to check on Jake. Sarah's parents were gone too, chasing after her, I figured. The staff looked lost, holding trays of food no one was eating. Jake finally turned to me. His eyes were red, but he wasn't crying, just exhausted. He walked over, slow, and stopped a few feet away. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at me like he was trying to figure something out. Then he asked why I couldn't let it go. I told him I wasn't the one who blew up the wedding, Sarah did that all on her own. He nodded, but it wasn't agreement, more like he was too tired to fight. He said he needed space, that he couldn't deal with me right now. Then he walked out, leaving me standing there with Linda and a hall full of awkward guests. The rest of the night was a blur. Linda and I stayed to sort things out, told the vendors to pack up, tried to salvage what we could. Most of the food got donated, and the deposits were a lost cause. I didn't care about the money anymore, just wanted it over. Jake didn't call that night, or the next day. I heard from my sister later that he'd gone to a buddy's place to crash. Sarah was out of the picture, at least for now. It's been 3 months since the wedding imploded. Jake's still not talking to me much, just short texts every couple weeks to say he's fine. He moved out of the apartment he shared with Sarah and got a small place near his shop. My sister keeps me updated when she hears from him, says he's working long hours, keeping his head down. Sarah's gone quiet too, no word from her or her parents. I don't know if they split for good, and honestly I don't care. The damage is done. Linda's still upset about how it all went down, she blames me for showing up, but she doesn't push it. We've been tiptoeing around each other, trying to get back to normal. I think about that day a lot. The $45,000 I spent is gone, no refunds, no apologies. People at work ask how Jake's doing, and I just shrug, say he's figuring things out. They don't know the half of it. I keep replaying the fight with Sarah, her screaming in that dress I paid for, Jake standing there like a ghost. I don't regret going. I had to show her she couldn't erase me. But I didn't expect it to end like that, with Jake walking away from both of us. Maybe I should have stayed home, let her have her win. Maybe it wouldn't have changed anything. Looking back, I see where it all went wrong. Sarah was a train wreck from day one, reckless, entitled, dragging Jake down with her. I tried to warn him, but he couldn't hear me over her. Now he's free of her, but I'm not sure what's left between us. I'll keep paying his phone bill, keep the door open. He's still my son, even if he hates me for it. Time will tell if he comes around. For now, I'm just glad that wedding never happened.